I want to begin with a little bit of additional color. I have two connections at Carleton that both relate to my past. When I was an undergraduate, I took what we would call junior year abroad and came and joined, I just became a political science student. And those days you had grade 13 in Ontario, and so the school insisted on making me a second year student. But being an obnoxious American, hi Roger, those days used to line up and they had like computers to do enrollment. And I went around the department and convinced professors to sign a piece of paper so I could get into fourth year and fifth year courses, even though I was only registered as a second year, which was great. And so to put this in perspective, this was 87, 88. And so one of the classes I still remember is I had a course with Glenn Williams, who had a course called The Political Economy of North America, and he had a somewhat bootleg copy of a draft of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and we were taking it apart chapter by chapter, and I was from Detroit, so I did the auto chapter, and we all did this early analysis of this thing, which now you could do with the USMCA and just try to see what do you think it's going to mean for the Canadian economy. So I feel very special. And I also feel lucky because I came back for a Fulbright and was a colleague of David's at the Norman Paterson School, which was while I was trying to write my dissertation. So in two key ways, Carleton has contributed to only the good side of me, all the bad habits I had. Anyway, So I wanted to talk about two things in regard to the new agreement, or at least two broad categories, and try to stick to time since I tend to ramble. The first is to talk a little bit about the agreement itself, such as we know. I'm sure you've had a chance to go through all 35 chapters. It's all online, about which more later. But I'm also then going to talk a little bit about the politics, because it's not the law yet. It has to get through ratification. We have midterm elections in a couple weeks in the US, a lot of questions about whether this is the deal or only the first iteration. And so I'll talk about the politics second, and then if that hasn't given us enough to talk about, I can, tell stories about my days at Carleton, I guess. Just fill in.
With Norman Hilmer.
Yeah, Norman Hilmer, yeah, I had classes with him. So, all right. First, about the agreement. So, to cut to the chase, the agreement is remarkably like NAFTA. For all of the, Trumpian Sturm und Drang, it preserves most fundamentally market access for Canada to the United States. What it does that is negative is it conditions that on a couple of new things. For an automotive, which is big here in Ontario, the rule of origin has gone up to 75% from 62.5, which was the NAFTA rule. Some of you will remember Canada-US Free Trade, it was 50% origin. The calculation of origin hasn't changed much. It's still super complicated. We haven't gone to the TPP full cumulation rule. We have this partial cumulation. Why does it matter? Because the rule of origin is the threshold of content you have to meet in order to get tariff-free treatment. So we say these things are free trade agreements. I don't know if we say that anymore in the Trump era, but because it's a bad word. But the idea of a free trade agreement is that you don't pay tariffs. But the way we've set up Canada's Free Trade, NAFTA, now the USMCA, is you only pay no tariffs if you qualify by meeting various terms and conditions. And that's what the rule of origin is all about. It's now 75% for autos. It was 50% for everything else before. Because they've changed the formula, there are other products for which the effective rate is going up because of what counts in and out. And if you get to this chapter, there's one of the chapters, I don't remember the number, I apologize, but the chapter heading is Special Exceptions to the Rule of Origin. In addition to the automotive chapter, this 234-page chapter has all sorts of calculations for very specific products. It's very complicated. So it is worse in that sense than the old agreement if you think it's more of a hassle to have more local content. And I'll say this about that. One of the downsides of the way this agreement changes our old NAFTA framework is that it makes it more expensive in terms of time and effort to comply with the rules. Now you might say, well, the rules are the rules. Yes, but if they're super complicated and you need to hire lawyers and you need to get everything lined up, then it means for small and medium-sized businesses, it's not as good an agreement because you're going to pay enough to do North American trade that it will cut into your profit margins, make it more difficult. It also makes you less flexible. There's a famous story from 3 years ago, actually. Honda, in making cars, they had a purchasing agent who bought, I can't even tell you what it was, some little widget from Vietnam rather than from their old supplier in Mexico. And that one decision, the widget itself was about a 3.5 cent widget, at least in US cents. We still have pennies, as you know. Can't get rid of anything with Lincoln's face on it. He's still one of the good ones. So that one change in that one part put the vehicles that use that part out of compliance with the rule of origin, and so they suddenly had to pay tariffs. And the U.S. bound rate's 2.5%, so it's not that bad, but it was an unexpected cost. And so what they decided to do was to pay a penalty for screwing it up, cancel the contract, for which they also had to pay a penalty just to get back into compliance. So if you think about that little problem for a range of companies making things across the border, if the rules are really complicated and you say to yourself, well, if I bought that from somebody else, I could find myself in big trouble and paying fines, you tend not to change. And when that change could help you stay competitive, you're not even looking at it because you don't want trouble, it's a problem. Companies around Canada, around the US, have shipping clerks, and they're sitting there trying to figure out how are we going to source all the pieces of our product. This is where rule of origin really comes to bite us. There were a number of things that you're probably familiar with because the Canadians, and Laura and David both know I object to this, called them the poison pills. And the implication of calling something a poison pill is that it was on the US agenda because we wanted to blow up NAFTA. And I think they were really ambitious things we wanted, and I don't think the intent was to blow up NAFTA per se, but that's a normative call, so you can decide what you want to think on that. With regard to those, just to pick them out, one was automotive rule of origin. And the auto companies have the people who know how all this works. It's extremely complicated. From the beginning, GM, Ford, Chrysler paired up with Toyota, Volkswagen, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, BMW, the other manufacturers who make cars in North America. And they created a common front. Not only the Detroit base, but all of the other assemblers. Then they went to their suppliers and created a united front among suppliers. Then they went to the unions, both Unifor and UAW and the TCM in Mexico, and got them on board. And then they went one more step to the automotive dealers, who, particularly for Congress, dealers matter because there's a dealer in everybody's riding or constituency. So if they're on board, and they all agreed, we want to have some system for continuing in autos. We don't want unilateral withdrawal from NAFTA. So that was very powerful with the Trump administration and with all the governments, and it allowed a door to be open. And so the negotiators from the firms were working very closely with the negotiators in the governments. And the Trump administration said it wanted the higher 75% rule, and then it was all about how are we going to do it. It's a boring side story, but the U.S. demand was for a higher rule of origin, full traceability, which means certificates of origin all the way down to the raw materials. They wanted an end to what they call Tariff Shift, which is this, when you change tariff classification, it's called Tariff Shift. So if it's meant, that's the substantial transformation is the old term for it. So if you have something that you have processed so that it started as sheet metal and it became a bumper, for example, or a car door, then it has changed tariff classification, and as long as you change to 2 digits, it would qualify as substantial transformation. The Trump administration called that tariff shifting and thought it was a sneaky way for people to have Chinese steel and aluminum and other things brought in, transformed, and then turned into supposedly North American product for the purpose of further rule determination. And that is actually what they do. More with German steel, because there are a lot of German specialty steels that suppliers use. And so for those things, the U.S. wanted to end that practice entirely. They also wanted immediate effect for the automotive rule of origin, and the automotive investment cycle is about 5 years. So nobody wanted immediate effect because they wouldn't have a chance to adjust. And when you put all of those demands on the table, the auto companies whittled them away bit by bit to get it down to where it is. And so once they signaled they were happy with this final agreement, I thought we were home free, and then the Trump administration demanded that Mexican workers be paid a higher wage. I'll talk about this a little bit with the politics, but that was a crucial demand. because it put a split between the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican negotiators. At first, the Mexican negotiators were very defensive, but the U.S. made the demand after the Mexican election from last summer, and as some of you will know, the new Mexican government or the president-elect, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he's a man of the center left, and he appointed a very experienced WTO World Bank official as his lead negotiator who started sitting in on the negotiations after the election in July, Jesus Seade. And Seade, who's a very nice guy and knows a million people in Washington, I'm sure in Ottawa as well, sent the signal that López Obrador doesn't think Mexicans, as a matter of pride, should be competing on low wages. Therefore, a higher rule of origin or a higher wage content requirement is fine with him. And he was even willing to entertain raising the minimum wage across the whole Mexican economy. It's not very high now. It's like $4.25. Now that's because he's not an economist. He's a politician, and he thinks that that's important. So your economics advisors or his economics advisors say, boss, don't do it. We actually do compete on low-wage labor. But he doesn't care. It's a principle thing. And so that made it possible for a deal to come together. The other division that created, however, was the Canadian negotiating team was ready to stand firm against this one more requirement because the car companies weren't thrilled about it. And they were disillusioned that Mexico so quickly agreed because they were ready to fight it. And one of the issues that was tough in this negotiation was that the U.S. team thought Canada should be with them in fighting on autos because Canada's lost jobs to Mexico on low-wage labor as well. So we should all be on one team, and the Canadian negotiators wouldn't really do common cause on autos. So that was a concern. And it made the U.S.-Canadian part of the negotiations tricky, and I can talk about that more in the politics, or if you have questions. Second poison pill was supposedly the sunset clause. And some of the coverage has given Mexico credit for having a breakthrough on the sunset clause. And the sunset clause would be the date by which we should automatically kill off the new agreement unless everyone agrees to keep it going, sort of default option. The U.S. proposed 5 years and then a firm sunset that would eliminate the agreement. Most companies didn't like it because only 5 years, you can't make investments on the basis of a short time frame like that. And so so what they wanted was no sunset. Canada came up with a very creative idea on what to do, but when the talks went to U.S.-Mexico bilateral talks towards the end, Mexico carried the idea forward, so it was in the U.S.-Mexico agreement first. So the press has tended to give Mexico credit, but I'm here to tell you it was a Canadian idea. Because Trump wouldn't give up on the sunset, they went with a 16-year sunset, figuring that 16 years from ratification, which presumably is next year, Trump is gone. So it's less risky to have a long-term, and plus companies would feel like with 16 years they had some predictability. So that was the solution. Canada should get credit. The U.S. added a 6-year review, which is going to come up pretty quickly, to see if any new changes need to be made, and a little bit about the politics. I don't want to dabble too, try to keep my bifurcated talk bifurcated. But I don't think it's a bad thing to have a new trade arrangement that can be updated. We did do updates in the old NAFTA framework, but it was always on the side. It was a Security and Prosperity Partnership or some other negotiation. Having an agreement that you can make adjustments to as the economy evolves is not a bad thing. So that part I'm fine with, and the 6-year review is good because it's not a review with a view to cancellation, so companies won't mind. But it will mean that we have, shortly after Donald Trump leaves office, an opportunity to do updates. And so I guess I'm jumping to one of my conclusions, but there will be a chance to fix this, even though I think this agreement is slightly worse than NAFTA, and we left a lot of things like labor mobility and other off the table. There'll be a chance to come back to this, perhaps with a different White House president. So that would be nice. Well, anyway, I'm not rooting either way. So that was the second one. The third was government procurement, but that actually turned out to be much easier to resolve. But if you're a free market economist, you won't like it very much. The U.S. was insistent that there be some Buy American on certain projects where the taxpayer was paying. It's very popular. If we're going to spend taxpayers' money, why can't we Buy American and that sort of thing? There was an agreement on a percentage, so all 3 countries can set aside some amount of procurement for their own taxpayers. Everyone agreed to that very quickly, so it turned out not to be much of a poison pill at all. But with big infrastructure projects, I think it's actually somewhat moot. in that, I don't know if you saw Donald Trump's infrastructure proposal. He promised $1 trillion in new infrastructure, but he only was willing to put 200 million taxpayer dollars into it. Or it's like, no, it was $1 billion. Then it was 200 billion that he was willing to put in. It's America, so you just add a 0 or 2. So 200 billion, but the problem is everything else is supposed to come from states and the private sector, so it's all P3, and you can only impose the Buy American requirement on the taxpayer-funded portion, which, at least in his plan, is not going to be very large. That'll be similar for Canada. Canada's very good at P3s. A lot of the money will come from pension funds and others looking for a better return. So I don't think it'll be as distorting as it might have been. But anyway, that's how that was resolved. Then there's dairy. Oh, I know how much Canadians love spending more on milk. Sorry, just kidding, just teasing. So we both distort dairy quite a bit, as you know. And the way we do it is antagonistic, much as the way we do softwood lumber is antagonistic. So I don't take a position on right or wrong, but there are different outcomes as a result of the way we do it. Canada maintains high prices at a low cost to the federal treasury by supply management. Limit the amount of production by giving every dairy farm a quota. They can produce up to that amount and they're guaranteed a price. If you're from the West, you had something similar with Canadian Wheat Board for a while, it'd be a set price. So that was the arrangement. And because supply was constrained, prices went up, and that's what you pay. The US, also worried about dairy farmers, provides direct subsidies. But what you subsidize, you get more of. And so we generate huge surpluses and have rock bottom prices. Now,
food stamps.
Yeah, food stamps. Well, yeah. So here, this is the defense of the American system. Milk is cheap. So if you're a single mom and you've got a fixed income or whatever, you can buy milk because it's dirt cheap. And the subsidies are paid for by the taxpayer, and the tax system is progressive, although some people say not as progressive as it could be. So if you make less, you pay less. So really, Bill Gates is paying for our cheap dairy, which is very nice. And so on the US side, it's better for poorer people. Canada just pays high prices. It's better for the Treasury because the Treasury doesn't have to tax you to pay for it because they've created this artificial constraint. Well, you've got to watch where all these things go. So anyway, our systems are antagonistic because dairy farmers in New York and Wisconsin look at the prevailing price of milk, cheese, other dairy products, and they think, oh man, I've got surplus I'm pouring down the drain because I can't sell it. So if I could just sell it for half the Canadian prevailing price, I'd be a rich man. And then they go to talk to Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, who's from Wisconsin, or Chuck Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, and say, hey, can you get me access to the Canadian market? And it looks good on paper. Of course, if American milk flooded here, the supply management system would collapse because you never maintain prices. So it can't work, so Canada resists. Now, in a bit of irony, I think quite a bit of an irony, in the Uruguay round of the WTO agreement, formerly the GATT, one of the things that the U.S. pushed for that we successfully got as a change was the tarification of quotas. So when you had quota systems, you had to create a tariff rate equivalent that was then a published number of what the tariff would be if you brought the product in. Well, before that, it was just a quota, and the idea was to make it transparent and then hopefully take it down by so many percentages a year. So Canada has a fairly high tariff, like 270% on imported dairy products, and you'll have very few tariffs on us anyway. And Trump fixated on this number, 270%. They're being so mean to us. The Canadians are terrible. Because it's the only thing, and it does stand out. It sounds bad. It communicates well to his voters how evil you all are. But it's the exception, not the rule. Most of the trade you don't have a tariff on. And he fixated on it because it was the one thing that nobody could deny was true. And he's like that. So this issue was very difficult. It was made more difficult, slight criticism here, it was made more difficult by an aspect of the Canadian negotiating strategy, which early on involved a lot of heartfelt lectures from Chrystia Freeland, a little bit from the Prime Minister, to the American side about the virtues of free trade. The post-war American system, how you guys made us all richer, you did such a great job, and free trade is good because it makes products available and choice, and you know, you got these hard-bitten trade negotiators like Robert Lighthizer. A, don't like lecturing, don't want to hear this, pontificating from Canadians. And then, as soon as the lecture is over, they'd say, yeah, what about dairy? They'd say, oh, well, it's very important for Canada, we've got to have our tariffs. And they're like, you hypocrites, we're going to make you eat your words. And so, I'm not quite really exaggerating, it became a personal, bitter, we're going to rub your face in this, and you are going to concede something. In the end, what Canada conceded was something that it was willing to give up in TPP, a version of what you did for CETA, which is rather than dismantle the quotas, you created quota space for American imports, 3.6%. And it was 3.5%, if I remember right, for TPP, and we walked away from TPP, but we would have had to share that with the New Zealanders, and they are milk exporting kings, so now we have it, and because Mexico does not export much in the dairy sector, it's mostly just for us. So we like it, it's a good deal. Writing's probably on the wall, the Canadian supply management system will continue to be under pressure in future trade negotiations, but for Justin Trudeau, he saved the system, and there are a lot of dairy farmers in Quebec and British Columbia and other places he'll want votes, and so I think politically it was a good outcome for him, but there was never any doubt that there was going to be some sort of concession on that, and it's not the worst. Sadly, it will not lower your prices of milk and cheese very much here. So if you were hoping for discounts, then again, your tuition is much lower than mine. So the system takes, the system gives away, you know. Anyway, so that's that. And then one of the ones that came up, you remember the dispute resolution mechanism. Mm-hmm. And this was one of the strangest things because in the 1980s, if you didn't like how the U.S. was dealing on a trade issue, all you could do is sue the American government in American court. And the U.S. Department of Commerce had set up something called an Administrative Law Tribunal. I don't even know if you have administrative law in the same way in Canada. So there's law, i.e. stuff passed by legislatures, and then there's administrative law, which is rules and regulations that the departments put out. And those rules and regulations are backed by a statute that gives the agency the power to write a rule, whether it's a safety standard for crash testing cars or how much fertilizer you're allowed to drink or whatever. There's a standard for everything. In the old days of less complicated government, Congress would be quite specific and prescriptive and say, we agree to a standard within this range, or you're allowed to do this or you're not. In the modern era, what Congress tends to do is to give broad powers to the agency to write their own rules. And those rules do go through notice and comment. There is a public input process, but when there are disputes about the rules, they're not really about the legislation, they're about the rulemaking. So individual departments have set up their own tribunals in which lawyers, often people who used to work in the department, review the behavior of bureaucrats and then make a determination as to whether it's consistent with the statute and is fair. There's a huge debate in U.S. legal circles about whether that's even constitutional, that these courts exist. My wife works for Health and Human Services. There is an administrative law tribunal for Medicare, for Medicaid, for Social Security. So if you don't think you got your benefits or you think you shouldn't have to pay for a treatment that Medicare should have paid for it, you hire a lawyer, you go to the tribunal, and you can get a determination on your case. That's the way the system works. In the old days, Commerce had just like that, administrative law tribunal. And the critique from Canada and other countries was, these guys are a bunch of hacks, first of all. They're not real judges. They're friends with everybody in the Department of Commerce, so they have a tendency to sort of tilt for the home team. So Canada's going to get no justice in front of these people at all. And that was one of the reasons that the Canadians in Canada's free trade pushed for an alternative dispute settlement mechanism. And you have these all over the place in law where instead of litigation, you go to an arbitration. Both sides agree to accept the decision that's come up with. And so Canada adapted that to create these arbitral panels that you had in Chapter 19 of Canada's Free Trade, and then you continued as Chapter 19 in the NAFTA. So that's why the government loves these things so much. Not on performance, because after very few early dispute panels, the U.S. has generally taken the view it will refuse to impanel a dispute panel if it thinks it's going to lose. I know, that doesn't seem fair, but the rules say that both sides have to agree to the arbitration or no dice. So if we think we're going to lose softwood lumber, you have, I think, 4 outstanding requests for softwood lumber panels, and we just refuse to appoint panelists. They say, oh, no, we're not going to do that. And then the Canadians go, oh, what are we supposed to do? Sue us. Here's the court. But here's the good news. The court has become a full Article 3 court with regular judges who are part of Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. It's judicial branch, so it's no longer administrative law. And the Court of International Trade, which is in New York, has a 45% remand rate. So 45% of the time, they send decisions back to the Department of Commerce for review. which means they're still finding slightly in favor of the U.S. government, but not as much as they used to. So why is that so objectionable? Well, first, I think a lot of Canadians don't realize that the change is a more professional court, but also, to defend in that court, you have to be a member of that court's bar. Canada has a very small but robust community of trade lawyers. They're not members of that bar. So what happens is if you're a softwood lumber company, you have to hire an American lawyer. Ooh, that's moolah. That's going to the States. It could be ours. So the trade bar here says, oh, these courts are totally unacceptable. They're taking bread off our table. So on the merits, I suspect that this wasn't as big a deal as it should have been. However, it became the big thing. I also think that for many of the trade negotiators in Canada, the dispute settlement mechanism is somewhat the Canadarm of NAFTA and Canada's free trade. You know, it's like this symbolic thing you invented that makes everything better. So, like, we can't give her up the Canadarm. That's so fantastic. So it was a little bit of an emotional tie to that thing, which I think made it more difficult. But in the end, Canada retained Chapter 19 dispute resolution panels. Mexico gave them up. So the panels will now be bilateral, only useful for U.S.-Canadian disputes. And if it's a trilateral dispute, it can still be submitted to the panel, but there cannot be Mexican judges or panelists because they gave it up. Sad, but there it is. And I think we're going to find more and more disputes going to court, in regular court in the U.S. However, again, irony, I think the U.S. is going to realize that this was not a good deal for us. Because while the U.S. court is not as home team biased as it used to be, the Canadian International Trade Tribunal is home team biased. So we will get better treatment from a panel, I think, than we would get by bringing a case to the Canadian International Trade Tribunal when you misbehave, or the Mexican equivalent. So typical Trump, focuses on the headline, but in the end, we'd probably be better off with the panels. But we kept them, so there it is. So that carries us through the poison pills. There are few other changes. I know you probably want to talk about Section 3210, the whole control. So this is very interesting. It's this Frankenstein's monster. It's all the negatives of a customs union without the benefits of a customs union. If we had a customs union, you know how that works. We'd all agree to the same external tariffs, and we would negotiate as a bloc. That's the way the European Union is, and you know that from CETA. The benefit is then there's no tariffs internally, and so you all agree on the outside, but you open up to each other. We never did that in North America, not in NAFTA, not in Canada's free trade. Why? Because our companies operate, for the most part, the big ones, in all three countries. And if Mexico does a deal with the European Union where it gets a break because it's a developing country, Ford's happy to ship certain products from Mexico to take advantage of that special loophole. And certainly if Canada gets a better deal in a Commonwealth country or with Korea, the U.S. companies will just ship from wherever they have to qualify under the best rules available. So they didn't want a customs union. Donald Trump, as you know, is building up to a major conflict with China. He wanted everybody on the same team, and so the language they use in this clause is very specific. A non-market economy for the purposes of trade remedy. Now, why that phrase? So to back up, Canada cannot, or Mexico cannot, or even the U.S., cannot negotiate a trade agreement with a non-market economy for trade remedy purposes unless it shares all its notes, communicates fully with partners, and if it comes up with an agreement the others don't like, they can either retract benefits or walk away from the new USMCA entirely. The phrase that matters is non-market economy for trade remedy purposes because non-market economy is usually defined by the standard of non-market economy that's in the WTO agreement, which is international. China is a market economy according to that rule. Some people think it shouldn't be, but it has been given that designation. Non-market economy for trade remedy purposes is a designation that was created by our U.S. Department of Commerce for the purpose of trying to screw over the Chinese. So the standard is one set by the Americans and judged by the Americans. And this is where the objection comes. It'd be one thing if it was, say, an international standard, but it is actually something that the U.S. determines. So that really does put a constraint on Canada and Mexico. On the plus side, China is not a joke. This is going to be a very big trade fight between us and them. And I think some people have said, well, but Canada could take an independent stance. But when it gets really ugly, that's kind of a dangerous thing to do anyway. So I think in the end, the reason that the government accepted this was they figured they were probably going to have to do it anyway, and now they can say to Canadian companies, Trump made me do it. like we think it's outrageous too, but Trump made us, and it was so it offloads the political responsibility. They probably shouldn't have agreed to it, but I think the U.S. was determined to keep the U.S. side in line. And I suspect we're going to do the same thing to the European Union as a condition of getting rid of steel, aluminum, and automotive tariffs on an ongoing basis. Say something about that. So obviously we didn't get rid of steel and aluminum tariffs under the Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. It's a protectionist measure of an expansion of trade act, but there it is. I have a scene in my head, I have no idea if this is right, of Donald Trump sitting at his desk and saying to Peter Navarro and his advisors, I want to be able to hit people with a tariff to get leverage in trade negotiations. And they said, well, there's Super 301, it takes several months, there's a process for challenge. Not good enough. I want something that I can do and that nobody can tell me I can't do. They said, wow, there's this national security thing. And national security is really awkward because U.S. courts don't like to question the determination of the executive branch on what is national security. So they almost never want to rule on that. Congress doesn't like to overrule because they assume the president's got all this intelligence, he's got all the military, like they know what they're doing. So if they say it's national security, we shouldn't argue with it. The polls say that people trust the president, even this president, more than they trust Congress or the judiciary. So nobody wants to mess with it. Even better, the U.S. negotiated a huge loophole in the WTO agreement and the GATT, that's actually it's in the old GATT, that says national security is an allowable exemption. And it's never happened. So the fear is that if the U.S. uses national security and you take this to the WTO will realize this is a loophole you could drive a truck through. There's nothing we can do. And if we rule against the Americans, it will be a green light for every country to declare national security on anything. And the whole international trading system will collapse. So this is very Trumpian. Play a game of chicken, and you want to take me down? I'm taking the whole system down with me, and so nobody has liked this from the beginning. Mexico was able to negotiate a stay on steel and aluminum tariffs, and also a stay on the right now threatened but not imposed auto tariffs as a condition for the 5 weeks of talks. And if the agreement becomes permanent, they should be able to hold that exemption, is what I'm hearing from the Mexicans. However, Canada did not get an exemption from steel and aluminum tariffs, which are still applied. The argument from the Commerce Department in the U.S. is Canada responded to those steel and aluminum tariffs, which are currently applied, by retaliation. So we can't begin to get rid of our tariffs until Canada walks back the retaliation. And it's going to be one of these, we're not going to get rid of our retaliation until you get rid of the... So they'll negotiate it, but they weren't willing to put it into the USMCA. The second thing, and to my mind the worst part, is the automotive tariffs. Now, we have not put the 25% tariff on autos yet. It's still being investigated and eventually would come out. But what the negotiators did was, in a side letter with Mexico and a side letter to Canada, they imposed a quota, a maximum number of finished vehicles that each country is allowed to export to the United States. And if you go over the quota, then the 232 25% punitive tariff is said to apply. And that's bad for a couple of reasons. One, because it validates this national security tariff process. It embeds it in a trade agreement as part of the enforcement of the agreement. And that will make it much harder for Congress to decide to claw back the power or to make changes later. So it embeds it in the rules. It's very sneaky. Second problem, Mexico's cap on the number of finished vehicles as exports is about double what they exported to the U.S. last year. Canada's cap is only a couple 100,000 vehicles more than what you exported to us last year. Now, last year was a big year. Car sales have been good. But what that means is Mexico can grow, but Canada can't. And I think if the caps were proportional, so Canada also had a double the last year's shipment, then that might be more tolerable, but it's going to kick in a lot sooner. Why? Because it only counts for finished vehicles. So what matters is where final assembly takes place. Those are the highest paid jobs in the auto sector, and the U.S. is trying to push them into the U.S. Bad news for Oshawa, not so bad for Canadian suppliers who can continue to participate on the rule of origin, but for assembly jobs, there'll be pressure to move those jobs back into the U.S. so that there's a little more flexibility. So as you can see, it's not a really great agreement. I want to say just a little bit about the politics now, because I'm from Washington, that's all we talk about, politics. From the beginning, this has been a fascinating negotiation. And I'm a little humbled by it. Trump recognized something that I think too few people in the U.S. recognized, which is that there were people who have not done well since globalization advanced. And you could say it's because of automation, you could say it's because of all kinds of things, but they fixated on NAFTA. Now, one of the truisms in American politics is if you do something, you must defend it. Because if you don't, your opposition will never stop saying bad things about it. We saw this with Obama's health care. On balance, it was a good thing, right? But critics never stopped saying it was the worst thing ever, and Obama and his team had other things to do and didn't defend it enough. So by the time Trump came along, most Americans thought it was a bad deal and bad legislation, and we're on the way to undermining the whole thing. And it wasn't the worst, but the critics held the day. Same with NAFTA. The critics of NAFTA never stopped, whether it was Ross Perot or Ralph Nader. People kept saying, the American economy would be better if we hadn't had that NAFTA deal. It was the worst deal ever. And Trump, and to the point that, not George W. Bush, but some Republicans, and certainly Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama both campaigned saying, we think NAFTA is a terrible deal. So this was a widespread view, but of course they were American politicians, so they mostly said they cared and then did nothing in office, so it was okay. But the problem was many people thought that's why politicians are scumbags, and that's why you can't trust them, and we have to find somebody who will not lie to us, and strangely, they thought Donald Trump was that guy. Now, the good news of this is that they didn't want to get rid of NAFTA because they had a list of complaints. It was just NAFTA coincided with when they thought their luck went bad and their town suffered. So Donald Trump has a huge amount of control politically over what constitutes a better deal. And if he's willing to go out and tell his voters this is a better deal, I think they'll believe him. Even because nobody's going to listen to this long lecture from like pointy-headed me to understand how it really affects. Nobody. No, they're going to say, look, Trump says good, he's got my back, I trust him. And everyone else is a hostage. If you love trade, or if you're a big business, then you're like, okay, well, this could have been a lot worse, and so I'm just going to shut up. I'll say, yeah, great deal, Trump, you're a genius, best deal ever, go for it, because you don't want him to blow it up. So you kind of have to play along. I expect, actually, this will go fairly well. Now, then you'd say, oh, but surely some of your great members of Congress will stand on principle. The problem with the members of Congress in both parties is that they're terrified. Republicans think, many Republicans who are big free traders, or the ones who are, say, Trump's changed the party. He's brought these blue-collar, workers into voting Republican. And that's our base now. So we can't afford to go against Trump on trade. We may have to give up free trade because this is who votes for us now. On the other hand, the Democrats are like, Trump's an aberration, he's horrible, he'll be impeached, we hope, and he stole those voters with his song and dance, but they're our voters. They're union people. They care about the things we care about and progressive values. So they're only on loan to Trump, and we're going to get them back. So they don't want to oppose Trump on trade either. You look at whether it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders, who was at my school just this week, what they're coming out and praising, they're not praising the deal, but they're not fighting it because they just don't know where the politics on trade fall. So Congress will pass it, I suspect, even if the midterm brings in a blue wave. Can I tell you something else? I just have to share this.
Go ahead.
So I have a friend. I think I told you this story, David. I have a friend who works for Nancy Pelosi, and we were out having drinks, and she almost never likes to talk politics because life is rough for her, and her husband's a big Republican, and she just doesn't want to hear it. But what she said to me while we were out drinking, when I briefly, he went to the men's room, I got to ask a question about politics, and then we went back to talking about kids and real estate. That's what you talk about. She said, here's what we're worried about. We know that Trump's trade protectionism is going to have an economic impact. This 4% growth, record low unemployment, is not because he's a genius. It's because we cut taxes, giving more people money, and then we blew the budget limits. And so we flooded an already good economy with cash. And it got a predictable result. The economy is overheating. That combined with some problems in Europe and elsewhere, it works. But it doesn't last. It will eventually catch up. And the trade war with China will start to pinch, etc. But it lags. And she said, this is my fear, that we get a blue wave, we take the House, the Senate's probably out of reach, but we take the House, and then Trump gets on Twitter and says, we had something going great. 4% growth, record low unemployment, fewer women, fewer blacks, fewer Hispanics on the unemployment line. It was awesome. And the Democrats get elected, these people are like the plague on the economy. The market's down, prices are up, inflation's out of control. These guys, terrible. And then runs in 2020 to try to push them out of the House and get reelected. And she said, we don't have a single Democrat with the kind of megaphone that can reach who he does. And even though that's bogus, we think he'd succeed. So the politics of trade are a mess in the U.S. I just can't emphasize enough. And I put my hope in the fact that we haven't done too much damage, that we have a built-in review coming up, and hopefully we can deal with some of the things that we were unable to deal with in the past. So I'll let you a ray of sunshine.
Yeah.
Just one. But at this point,
Which ray was that? Sorry. I'm not sure.
sometime in the distant future.